The world of Nasria found itself in a precarious place after the destruction of Skajek and his allies in the freeholds. The kingdom of Ventaris had been ravaged at all sides during the conflict, and eventually, the empire that had reigned over the world for almost 400 years, began to topple. Ruluther was lost to the northern Kazachil tribesmen who swept down from the mountains side by side with the mountain elves. This alliance allowed them to overwhelm the beleaguered Ventari defenders. Chieftain Laraeljif the Red-Handed took control of Ruluther and had all the noblemen who sympathized with Ventaris put to death. He also gave the mountain elves complete control of their homelands, with assurances that they should never be troubled by humans again. Now, the Rulutherian people begin to acclimate to their new barbarian rulers. The freeholds, with leadership from Sandishruxta, find themselves now fully in control of their own lands. Free from the corruption of his sister, the Lord of the Freeholds has now fully pledged himself to making the Freeholds a place of safety and prosperity for his people. Their close alliance with the Diurga of the nearby mountains has them in an advantageous position for becoming an economic powerhouse. The Karixti Archipelago goes back to being self-governed city-states ruled by pirate barons. However, the Dragonborn now openly live in their own lands, and they demand tribute from all the city-states of the archipelago. With no human lands being large enough to threaten them, the Dragonborn slowly build their empire, but this time they are less focused on conquest and more focused on trade. In Ventaris itself, the borders fall all the way back to where they were 400 years ago. The armies of the country have been devastated from near-endless wars, and the excursion into the lands of the Dawnspire left their forces depleted to a level thought unthinkable. For the first time, the unshakable faith of the Ventari people begins to falter. The commoners call for reforms within the church as they starve in the streets. The children of silence are sent out to quell any voice of insurrection with brutal efficiency. It is now that a schism begins to form in Sukrathism, with many priests formally leaving the church and calling for less draconian measures and more inclusion. The church doubles down on stamping out any unrest, and half of the remaining army defects. Civil war begins in the streets of Ventaris and sweeps the rest of the country. It is a short conflict, but the church loses out. Reformist Sukrathists take charge of the government and install a provisional government led by a council of leaders who represent the wisest and most affluent of society. Eventually, Ventaris begins to flourish, but in the darkness the orthodox Sukrathists plot to retake what was once theirs. In the lands of the Dawnspire, the decimated populations begin to heal. The Dragonborn put aside their age-old feud with the Tritons and work toward rebuilding everything the armies of Ventaris destroyed. The Ash Elves and River Elves put aside their differences as well, and they cease a war that lasted longer than any could remember. The Ventari invasion had united the peoples of the Dawnspire, and their feeling of camaraderie gave way to unbridled anger over what had been lost. A hatred for those who had wronged them grows, and the River Elves, with help from others, begin to build a fleet to bring vengeance to the invaders across the ocean. In the years that follow Skajek's fall, the weave begins to heal. The weaver knits together the protective fabric, and the hellish rifts stop appearing altogether. Magic slowly returns to the world, and the study of the arcane arts spreads across all of Nasria once more, except for in Ventaris, where the old ways hold on a bit stronger. In the Nine Hells, Mahadi continues to entice the servitude of those who seek his rewards, but much has changed. With Fergus Boghole as the new ruler of Hell, the focus becomes less about incursions into various worlds and more about defeating the armies of chaos from the abyss. Fergus rallies the other lords of Hell to his banner, quashing any outliers who think they have the power to usurp him. As for the heroes that managed to defeat Skajek at Lanakost in the Freeholds and also in the bottom level of Hell, they left after their victory, passing into the realm of stories and legends. Iban, now inhabiting the bodies of his dual spirit, those of the two elven brothers who started the war between the elves, works with Fergus to combat the armies of chaos. Under his guidance, the armies are pushed back to the mouth of the river Styx, and a new battle line has formed for the first time in countless millennia. With the weave finally restored, Estrid is able to stop fighting the war against the dark power inside of her. With the whispering voice from the deep silenced, she focuses herself instead on the worship of the Matron of Moons and achieves a peace and serenity she had only dreamed of. In the wastes southeast of the Dawn Spire, Eurydice leads her people from the Temple of Souls, battling against the harshness of the lands. Eventually, she receives a vision of a massive temple jutting up from the red sands. When her people arrive at the temple, they must fight through hordes of snake people, but when they reach the inner sanctum, they find a large spider. Seated atop the spider is the reanimated body of Oriana. From here, the new Temple of Souls flourishes, as human nomads from nearby join the order and begin serving Oriana as their new high priest. After his brief meeting with Hans, Neves senses power coming from the ring on Hans's hand that feels similar to that of the Aboleths. After some time, Neves convinces Hans to let him coax the soul forth from the ring. It is revealed to be a powerful Triton sorcerer who had fought against the Aboleths before. His soul was sealed inside the ring when the Aboleths killed him. By utilizing the magics of the Tritons, the soul was transferred out of the ring into a shell that Neves could carry with him. With his new companion, Neves set about learning all that he could about the Aboleths to help his people overcome their ancient foe. He eventually learns of a technique to inhibit the enslavement powers of the Aboleths. With this breakthrough, his people undertake the greatest mobilization in their history. Legions of Tritons descend on the Aboleths and hunt them to extinction. A special order of warriors and scholars is created to be ever vigilant should the Aboleths be found again, and Neves works for the rest of his life keeping a watchful eye toward the depths. Jill, only pulled into this conflict by fate, returns to her homeland and finally finds some peace in her life. She spends most of her time in her massive grove playing with face spirits and eating sweet cakes. The adventuring life is looked at with fond memories, but she is completely complacent in her new, happy life of comparable simplicity. Kindred, seeing his task finally accomplished, returned to the Feywild in the lands of the Dawn Spire. From Sumrog's corpse, he had harvested the blood of creation. With this mystical power in hand, he went to the site where he had killed the golden stag and poured the blood into the rich soil. After months of camping by the site, he was awoken by a thrashing sound, and as he dug through the golden moss that had grown in the area, he found a golden fawn stumbling and trying to take its first steps. He spent the next few decades raising the fawn into a stag, and he devoted the rest of his life to being its caretaker. In his new role in their fantastical realm, Kindred had finally found the peace and purpose he had so sorely wanted. Gregor Vert eventually returned to Ventaris and took up his priestly duties. However, with all the strife within the church, he was one of the first to formally leave the Church of Sucrath, and he was instrumental in leading the reformation of the church. When the reformist Sucrathists seized power, Gregor was made the Archbishop of Ventaris, and he delivers sermons to thousands of citizens each holy day. He is also in charge of all religious matters in the massive city. During his time as Archbishop, he pushes for reforms that see Sucrathism become more inclusive and tolerant. He is also the reason for Cornelio attaining sainthood. Over the years, he worked diligently to turn the church into something that his adoptive father would have approved of. Elias spent the following years after the fall of Skarjek wandering the lands in contemplation. Unsure of his role in the world as a reincarnated saint, he could not see where his individual self ended and Vokun began. During these years of travel, he rooted out evil wherever he could find it, passing out judgment on those who deserved it. He eventually perfected the gaze of Vokun and could make any sinner recall their past actions with just a brief stare. Elias felt good about his actions during this time, but he still could not decide what his actual place was in the world. He found his way back to the realm of the elves in their hidden grove. There, he met with his old friend Vuthrin and partook of the pixie root once more. As he stumbled around in the night, the elven queen visited him in a secluded grove. She took him to a bed of moss and they made love in the moonlight. As he awoke, Elias thought it was all a dream until he received a summons to the queen's chambers. While there, she offered Elias a new role in Terris Felna, which was almost prepared for the elves to inhabit once more. She wanted him to serve as an outside voice in her council, to serve as a fresh perspective for the elves. He agreed to this and found renewed purpose in his life. Any matters involving those from outside elven culture was set before Elias to receive his judgment, and he gained a reputation as a wise and honorable judge. His new appointment fulfilled him, and his late-night encounters with the queen continued. Eventually, they stopped hiding their romance and were married, and he went on to father 3 half-elven princes, ensuring that relations between elves and humans would only grow stronger as time passed. Some elves saw such a dilution of the bloodline as blasphemy, and they split off to form their own country, but the queen decided to let them go and not intervene. Lucy found herself unsure of what to do once the battle was over, as she still heard the sirens' call of combat whenever there was silence. After spending several months gambling in and around the freeholds, she spent her winnings hiring would-be adventurers and formed her own mercenary company, the Scarlet Blades. She took her company and traveled the archipelago, selling her services to the highest bidder. Eventually, the Scarlet Blades became known as one of the most powerful and effective mercenary companies in the whole world. Darja fell into a deep depression after the battle. As her companions went about their lives finding their way in this post-Skarjek world, she could only think of the atrocities she had committed. There was a year-long period of bar fights and drunken blackouts before she finally saw a vision. She saw the gleaming white spire of Terrace Felna. The next day she threw away her flasks and bottles and began making her way to the elven city. Once there, she saw the elves taking control of their city away from the remnants of Ventari forces. She worked with them, fighting on their behalf when skirmishes broke out. Once the city was secured, she learned that other elven cities had been abandoned, and dark malevolent creatures had taken up residence there. She pledged herself to gain back all the elven settlements. Plunging headfirst into danger, she vanquished many creatures and eventually stories spread of her deeds. Elven bards began to write poems and songs of her exploits, and her adventures became legend even in Ventaris on the other side of the world. After years of working to become a true hero, Darja finally could look upon herself with pride. Hans disappeared for a while after the battle. Almost a year later, word spread that a new lord had appeared in the northern freeholds at a massive manor where lavish parties were held. Lord Penthwood was known as a gracious host who had the most luxurious life that any person could imagine. This went on for several years, until eventually the parties stopped and Lord Penthwood disappeared altogether. Hans had found the ruse of living as a nobleman tiresome, and he decided to get back to the adventuring life he so dearly missed. Through his travels he lived 1,000 different lives, each more grand than the one before it. Elwicked was called to the Weaver within a day of being free from the 9 hells. The enigmatic spider god explained that the work ahead would be hard, as the Weave still needed intense mending. Like a good soldier, Elwë worked in service of the Weaver for several more years. One day the Weaver summoned him and Elwë asked what his new job was. The Weaver simply said it was his time to be free as he had paid his debt. He was cast out of the Weaver's realm and found himself in a small port town near to where he was born. There, Elwë found a masterfully constructed ship waiting for him, fully crewed. Waiting in front of the ship was his new first mate, who asked what the captain's orders were. With a smirk, Elwë boarded his new ship and set his eyes on the endless horizon. Amon left the battlefield and returned to the elven people. He fought with them to secure lands until the elves had reclaimed everything that had been lost. During this time he had also managed to track down Cornelio's body and preserve it. Once his work with the elves was done, Amon took Cornelio's corpse to the ruined Feywild and buried it next to where Cornelio's wife was interred. As Amon finished his work, a light rain began to fall around the burial site. From the graves 2 flowers emerged and intertwined with each other. Over the coming days and weeks, Amon watched as many plants began to grow in the surrounding area, fed by the rains that continually fell from overhead. It would be a long process, but Amon would see to it that this world would be restored. Nasria is not free from peril, as there are still many threats to the world's stability. However, it is finally free from the taint of Skajek and able to determine its own fate. Many heroes stood side by side to ensure the safety of the world and all its peoples, and without their heroic sacrifices and victories, the darkness would have surely claimed them all.